All right, welcome Big Deuce soldiers and family members to virtual date night. For any of you who don't know, this is my wife, Maddie. She's going to be joining us here for this online version. Originally, we had planned to do a real date night, have childcare, food, lesson, and then an activity planned as well. But with this COVID-19 and social distancing, we had to kind of adjust fire just a little bit. But even while we couldn't meet in person, we still felt that it was important to reach out to you guys online, because as we talk about relationships, and we're going to film 2 videos, this one's going to be our marriage relationship, but as we talk about marriage relationships, there is no more important relationship in your life than the relationship you have with your spouse. As we go through life, we're going to encounter all sorts of trials. There's going to be all sorts of stress. There's going to be all sorts of problems throughout. It's going to feel at times that the world is just crashing down on you. But when we do marriage right, you'll always have that person who's in your corner. You'll always have that person who's with you no matter what. Even when it feels like nobody else is with you. When we do marriage right, you have that teammate, that partner for life. And so even though we couldn't meet in person, we still felt it important to go through and to do this class and this training online, because when we do marriage right, there's peace in the home, we have that teammate, we have that partner, and we have that person who's with us no matter what. And so the purpose of this training, today we're going to be really discovering ways to address conflict in a healthy manner. Because even though we're always a team, it may not always feel like it. Even though we're always a team, conflict is still going to arise. And so today we're going to be looking at some healthy ways to address that conflict when it does arise. And I think that the big thing about conflict is that conflict always starts with mismatched expectations. Mismatched expectations. You know, we all have pride. We all struggle with pride, and sometimes pride leads us to think that things are always going to go the way that we hope that they'll go. Things are always going to go the way that we want them to go, but obviously that's not always the case. And even though you as an individual may have that desired way for things to go, your spouse may have a completely different opinion. And so when we encounter these mismatched expectations, it's going to lead to conflict. And I think that the best way to address this conflict is just to communicate our expectations on the front end. And now some of you guys who are watching this, maybe you've been married for 10 months. Maybe some of you have been married for 10 years. But when we communicate our expectations, it's going to help us to avoid conflict later on. And even if you have been married for 10 years, you know, life is always changing. We're always entering into new stages of life. Maybe when you first got married, you didn't have any kids. It was just the two of you. All of a sudden, kids come along, and life has completely changed, and we need to set new expectations. All of a sudden, those kids become teenagers, and once again, life completely changes, and we need to start talking about new expectations. Then the kids are gone, and once again, life changes. And so we're always going through these new phases in life, and we're always going to have, as individuals, expectations on the way things should go, but those aren't always going to naturally align. And so we need to be having those types of conversations where we can communicate those expectations to avoid conflict on the other side. Now, I think that really, especially early in a marriage, the biggest influence that we have, the biggest kind of source that we have that build our expectations is what we see from our parents. It's what we see from our parents. And so maybe some of you watching, you know, you had parents that you really looked up to. They had a system that worked for them. Things went great, and you took that and you said, that's how I want to see my household look like. Maybe some of you, your parents didn't really have a plan and it was chaos, but it worked. And that's kind of the idea that you had going into your marriage. Or maybe some of you, you know, growing up, your parents had a lot of conflict. Your parents didn't necessarily have a plan that worked, and so you want to be different from what you saw from your parents. Or maybe even another group, if you grew up in a single family, a single parent home, and you saw one person do it all, that could influence you as well. Maybe you're somebody who tends to micromanage things because you saw your parent who did everything, who had to do everything, or maybe, you're someone who kind of takes a step back as well because you saw that one parent do everything. And so no matter what household you're coming from, one of the biggest influences to our expectations going into a marriage is that of what we saw from our parents. And so I know for me growing up, my parents had a system that worked for them. Man, my parents were amazing. I look up to my parents, and I didn't really see a whole lot of serious conflicts growing up. They had a system that worked. For the most part, my dad, he kind of handled a lot of the finances, and when I was growing up, it was a lot before all the apps and the online banking, so I would watch my dad sit there, take all the receipts and try to balance the checkbook at the end of the month. He handled a lot of the outside chores. He fixed stuff when it was broken. And then on the other side, I saw my mom. She mostly, worked with the kids. She mostly helped us with our homework. She mostly did a lot of the indoor chores. And it was a system that was probably more traditional, but it worked for them. And so when me and Maddie got married, I came into that marriage with kind of these thoughts of, I liked how their system worked. And so that was kind of the idea that I had coming in to our marriage. And I know Maddie had a fairly similar situation growing up. But Maddie, you want to speak to your parents?
Yeah, my parents, they both worked full-time when I was growing up, but there was still kind of the typical gender roles in that my mom did most of the cooking and the cleaning, and she took care of my siblings and I for the most part, and my dad did kind of the yard work and took out the trash and whatnot. But it was interesting because over time I saw how this started to cause conflict because my mom felt like she was going to work and then coming home to more work around the house, whereas my dad had more time to kind of rest. So I saw them kind of work through that conflict and adapt to where my dad started doing more of the cooking and did more with my siblings and I so that my mom could have some time to rest. So that kind of changed over time, and that shaped what my expectations were coming into our marriage. So knowing that my parents had a little bit of conflict surrounding expectations, it made us want to prepare and discuss that in our relationship. We used the SYMBIS survey that Jack might talk about here, but that was kind of a tool that we use to discuss expectations for the first time. And we did that before we were even engaged. We were still just dating, so we did that really early on. Which was good because we were able to start thinking about those things and establishing appropriate expectations before we even had a chance to really form expectations that would ultimately cause disappointment. And we had time to talk through any differing expectations that we had so that we could begin the process of compromise and just starting to figure it out early on.
Yeah, absolutely. And so just like Maddie said, one of the things that we wanted to do is just to communicate those expectations before we even got married. And so as we got married, we had a plan. And I would encourage you, communicate those expectations and have a plan, but be prepared to be flexible. Because we kind of had this idea that we were going to do things somewhat similar to the way our parents did them. And then all of a sudden we found ourselves in a tiny little 500 square foot apartment where we didn't have any outdoor chores. We found ourselves all of a sudden where, as I was working at the church, my role started to change at the church where I was working who knows what hours every week was different. Maddie found herself, as she just graduated nursing school, she was working 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. And so all of a sudden I'm home at odd times during the day. She's asleep during the day. I'm at home at night sometimes, and she's at work at night. And so all of a sudden, these expectations that we had set needed to change and needed to be reevaluated. And so it meant that we had to continually sit down and have conversations. Okay, maybe this isn't working. And so what do we need to do to keep our household going? What do we need to do to make sure that we're both getting adequate amounts of rest? What do we need to do to make sure that we're having time for ourselves as well? And so we all have these expectations going in. It's good to communicate them. It's good to have a plan, but always be prepared to be flexible. And so mismatched expectations, they are the source of conflict. It's always a source of conflict. And I think that there are three very common sources of those mismatched expectations that we all encounter, each one of us in our lives. And I think, we're going to talk about those now, but I think one of The most common ones, and it may seem like a really trivial one, but it's just simply household chores. And that may not be necessarily like the source and the beginning of conflict, but how often do we see household chores kind of being that last straw that really leads to that conflict? And so, our parents, like I said, they influenced our expectations and whatnot, but I think, this is really an area where me and Maddie have a lot of work to do, to kind of talk about, what are our expectations for chores around the house? What are our expectations just for taking care of the house, taking care of our two crazy dogs and whatnot? But, just as I said, she's now working days, but still 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. And as I'm here, obviously working as a chaplain, right? Like we have different schedules that we need to be able to find a way to balance. And so, that's probably an area that we really could work on and reevaluate. But yeah, so the household chores are one of the biggest things. And so have a plan. And it may mean that you need to reevaluate if it doesn't work, but have a plan that works for you that's not just loading everything up on one spouse, but come to an agreement. And when I talk about this, it's also important to talk about expectation management, that you're not going to probably get exactly what you want, but that in a marriage relationship, we need to be putting that relationship over the conflict, and so we need to find ways to compromise and find a system that works, that's healthy, and that fits for both of you and both of your schedules. Now, the second area that I think is kind of one of the biggest sources of conflict as far as mismatched expectations is in our finances. The number one cause of divorce and the number one cause of serious fights in North America is money fights. It's differences of opinions on how to handle the finances. And so as we first got married, we didn't really have a plan. We didn't have many expectations. We didn't really talk about this going into it. Our plan was just to kind of wing it. We didn't have a budget. We didn't really have any financial goals. We were just kind of living paycheck to paycheck, trying to figure it out. But as we went through Financial Peace University, which is a class that I started teaching here at this unit, and we teach it twice a year, I would encourage everyone to come as we do it again in September. But as we kind of went through that process of going through Financial Peace University, our way that we approach finances, our expectations even of each other with regards to finances started to change.
Yeah. So now what we do is we do a budget at the beginning of every month. We sit down together and we work out our budget using Dave Ramsey's Every Dollar app, which has been really great to keep us organized. But we just put every single dollar that we're making into a specific category, whether it be necessary expenses like groceries and gas for our cars, or fun things like eating out, or he has his gas station money where he can buy his Monsters and his sodas, and I have my Amazon money so I can buy my odds and ends online. But then we also allocate our savings money too into those specific categories, various things that we're saving for. So we do all of that at the beginning of the month, and then we stick to that budget throughout the month, and that's been the biggest change in our life as far as finances.
Yeah, absolutely. And what that's going to do as you get organized, it's going to take away a lot of the arguments, because now all of a sudden you have an agreed upon plan. And so that means when I come home, just like she said, I have my gas station budget. So when I come home with a cherry Coke or something, she has really no room to be upset with me because it's in the budget. It's what we agreed to. And it's just the same way when I come home and there's an Amazon box sitting on our front porch. It's no problem. We agreed to it. We know this is the plan that we have set for each other. We talked about our expectations ahead of time when the month started. And I really believe that if we get organized in our battalion, and if spouses will sit down with each other and come together on a budget that works and stick to it, it's going to remove a lot of the conflict that we see in our marriages, because we have an agreed upon plan. We're on the same side. We have talked through those expectations on the front end, and we're on the same page. Now, other than organizing and creating a workable budget, I think that there's two keys within handling our finances that can alleviate a lot of the conflict. And the first thing that I believe is transparency. It's transparency. A lot of money fights occur because of hidden purchases, right? hidden purchases, or even hidden debt, trying to hide things from your spouse. And that's the great thing about the budget, really, is that once you have that workable budget, you don't feel the need to hide things from your spouse. Guys, you don't have to try to hide your Xbox or your PlayStation games that you bought that month. Ladies, you don't have to try to hide the shoes that you bought that month or whatnot, because you've already agreed to it. And so once you agree to that budget and you stick to it, you have more transparency. You don't feel the need to hide things, because when you hide things, your spouse is going to find out, right? Because of online banking and because of all these different things, it's so easy to see where your money is going. And so having that transparency is one of the big ways to alleviate some of that conflict.
Yeah. So another big thing is creating goals, financial goals. 94% of couples who describe their marriage as great say that they also discuss financial goals. On the other side, people who describe their marriage as just okay or in crisis, only 45% of them say that they discuss financial goals. So obviously the discussion of financial goals in a marriage is very important to the happiness of that marriage. Everybody has financial goals, things that you're going to want to be able to do and to buy in the future. So it's important to think about those things now so that you can start saving and you can be prepared. So most people are going to want to be able to retire someday, so it's a really good idea to go ahead and start contributing to a retirement fund now. And then for us, we also have a goal to buy a house at some point, and we have a specific budget with a specific down payment in mind, so we're saving for that. We're also planning for things like buying a new car for me in a few years, so we have a fund for that, and we even have a vacation fund for this year. So we have both short-term and long-term goals, but there are things that we've talked about and we're preparing for. So if you think about your future goals now, they become a lot more achievable if you start planning for them financially as soon as possible. And it's fun to have something to work towards too, I think. I think it's fun to see our house fund grow and to see how much closer we're getting every month. So there's an aspect of it that can be enjoyable as well.
Absolutely, right? There's some good side effects to that as far as, like she said, it builds teamwork. We're moving towards this goal, and it kind of, I think it strengthens our relationship, but also especially talking about expectations and mismatched expectations. Look, I know each one of you has financial goals, but the important part, are you communicating that with your spouse? Do you know your spouse's financial goals? And so when we sit down and we talk about our plans for the future and we talk about those goals and we find, those goals that we can work towards together, it's going to strengthen your relationship and it's going to alleviate conflict because you're on the same page working towards the same goals instead of working towards different goals and not even knowing those expectations if you're keeping them hidden, right? So we want to have those conversations and we want to share our goals with our spouse when it comes to finances. I think that probably the third most common mismatched expectation, it centers on time management, right? We all have so much that we're juggling. We all have so many different responsibilities. We all have so many things that we want to do, things that we have to do. For me and Maddie, we both work full time. We both have hobbies that aren't necessarily shared hobbies, and so we both want to, do our own hobbies. We both need to balance work. We both have other responsibilities. We both have family. We both have friends, and so all of a sudden we have all of these things that we're trying to juggle in the air at the same time, and we all have kind of that expectation that when we come home at the end of the day from work, how that time is going to be spent. It's so crucial, right, to talk about, what do you expect when you get home? And that may seem like a small, trivial thing, but take a Saturday, take a Sunday, and talk about, hey, this week, this is what I have going on. This is my shoot schedule. This is my log ops schedule. This is my work schedule. These are some of the things I have going on, and this is what I would like to do this week. This is what I would like to see this week. And so as we, really kind of start to work through what your expectations are for just how you spend your time, how you spend your weekend, it's important to make that time to spend with your spouse. It's important to have that quality time. There's no substitute for quality time.
Right. So I'm going to kind of go into quality time a little bit. And if you've ever heard of the 5 love languages, one of them is quality time. And people whose top love language is quality time feel the most loved when they're spending quality time with their partner. Now, there are 4 other love languages, so quality time might mean more to some people than to others, but spending good quality time with your partner is always going to be important in your relationship. And that quality time looks different to different people. So, for example, Jack is perfectly happy when we're sitting and watching TV together or when we play a game together. That's quality time for him. But for me, quality time is meaningful when we're sat down with no distractions, having a conversation. And for some people, quality time means going for a walk together or sitting on the couch and watching a movie after you put the kids to bed, or date night every Friday, or even just going to bed 20 minutes early so that you can lay there and talk about your days before you go to sleep. You just have to figure out what works for you and your partner, what it looks like to have quality time that is meaningful and fulfilling for both of you, and then making sure that you do it consistently. You have to make the time in your schedule regardless of how busy you are, because if you don't, you'll always be too busy. Something else will always come up.
Yeah, absolutely. We all have kind of expectations on what quality time looks like. Sometimes in a marriage they look the same, sometimes they look a little bit different, but it's important to communicate, what does quality time mean for you? So that way you can, plan out your week to make sure that you're getting real quality time. I think as well with time management, we all have the expectation, we all have the need for rest. We all do. And I think that rest is so important. But I think that there are 2 different kinds of rest. There's physical rest that we all need, which may mean, going to bed a little bit earlier. It may mean that you just need to come home and flop down on the couch. We all need that time to recharge. But I also think that there is emotional rest. And emotional rest, I think, lasts a lot longer than physical rest. You may go home, flop down on the couch, recharge a little bit, but then that's gone the next day when you're back out there on the gun line, when you're back out there in the motor pool. But that emotional rest that comes with that quality time that Maddie was talking about, that can re-energize us for weeks or months at a time. And so we need to be making sure with our time management and putting together those expectations for time management that we're getting both. That we're getting both the physical rest that comes from just relaxing and unplugging and unwinding, but also that emotional rest. To take some time away from, the busyness and the craziness of life, to do those hobbies that you share, to get that quality time together with your spouse. So both that physical rest and that emotional rest. And so no matter what, we may do the best that we can, but conflict is going to arise. We are going to see, we're going to have mismatched expectations that lead to conflict. But even in the midst of that conflict, when those expectations don't align, there are certain things that we can do to make sure that we're putting the relationship over the conflict, to make sure that we're protecting our relationship. And I think the first thing that we can do is just to know yourself. And some of our soldiers in 2-2, maybe you've heard me talk about this a lot, but I think that one of the biggest keys to handling conflict in a marriage is to know yourself, how you respond to conflict, but also to know how your spouse responds. And so I know for me, one of the ways that I typically and most frequently respond to conflict between me and Maddie is to avoid. I'm an avoider when it comes to conflict for the most part. Which means, I sense that there's conflict and I just want to kind of push it to the side. I want to just kind of ignore it, I guess you could say. Sometimes, though, I am a competitor, and there's different types of conflict resolution, and competition is one of the ways that I do respond to conflict sometimes, which means that, we could argue every once in a while, and I want to get what I want, right? I want to win the argument sometimes. But knowing this about myself, knowing that I'm an avoider for the most part, it means that I know I need to take that extra step to bring it up. Because when we push our emotions down, when we avoid conflict, it's just going to continue to build up in us until we can't contain it any longer. But also knowing that sometimes I'm a competitor, it means that, maybe I need to take a step back, take that breath, get that kind of perspective before we kind of go into our disagreements, when we go into our mismatched expectations.
Yeah, so for me, I also tend to be kind of an avoider, but I'm more of a passive-aggressive avoider. So I'm not claiming that's a good thing, but when there's something that's bothering me, I'll make it pretty clear that I'm upset, but I don't like to come right out and address it. I prefer Jack to take the lead in addressing the conflict. So it's something that I know about myself, and so I know that I have to um, be okay with addressing something in the moment and bringing it up, but Jack also knows that about me as well. So
Yeah, absolutely. And with conflict, no matter how it arises, no matter what expectation was mismatched, no matter what expectation you felt like wasn't met, the goal of conflict always is to strengthen the relationship. The goal of handling conflict is to repair that relationship. It's to work on some of the issues that maybe you're feeling like need the work, right? But the goal is not to win the conflict. The goal is not to avoid the conflict. The goal is to strengthen the relationship, and we need to make sure that we're putting the relationship over the conflict. But knowing your styles, knowing how you typically react to conflict, it can help us achieve that goal to strengthen the relationship. Because there are going to be times where our expectations don't align. There are going to be times where we may try as hard as we can to communicate things on the front end, but we're going to overlook something. We're going to encounter a different situation. We're going to encounter a difficult time in life that we weren't expecting. Life is going to have unexpected things that pop up. And so that conflict is going to arise, but we need to make sure that we're putting the relationship over the conflict. And something as well that can kind of further that conflict and can make it maybe a little bit more intense is just outside stressors. You may have this expectation and your spouse may have a different expectation. They're not being met. It leads to conflict. And all of a sudden that's compounded when you've had a rough day at work. All of a sudden that's compounded when you have extended family who are adding pressure into the situation. And so something that I do, and again, if you're a 2-2 soldier, you've probably heard me talk about this a lot because I think that this is so important, is that when you have all these stressors, this internal conflict that's going on in your relationship, you have all these outside stressors as well. I think it's important to, when you get home, to make sure that you're not just trying to put everything into different boxes, but instead you're trying to process that. And you're trying to work through it on your own internally. And so something that I do is, just on my way home, if I've had a rough day, I'll just start at the beginning and I'll kind of work through and think through what happened that day. I'll try to gain some perspective. Sometimes it means that, I need to just get frustrated and vent in my car. Sometimes it means, maybe I need to kind of pound on the steering wheel a little bit or something like that. But I think, I don't want to take that stuff and bring it home. And so I just try to process it the best I can. And, instead of, we talk a lot about putting our emotions, putting our feelings in different boxes and trying to separate home from army. But what's going to happen? Eventually those boxes are going to overflow and they're going to start to mix. And so I think a better strategy than that is to process our emotions and to find a way to deal with it and communicate it with your spouse as well. You don't need to keep everything away from home, but communicate with your spouse. They care about you. They want what's best for you. And so have a way to work through it instead of trying to separate it until it eventually spills over and compounds and makes that conflict that you might have with your spouse even worse.
mm-hmm. Yeah, and for me, my default way of handling stress, like if I have a bad, stressful day of work and I come home and the house is a mess or something, my default would be to blow that out of proportion and get mad at Jack because the house is a mess. But knowing that about myself, I do try to do things to de-stress after a long day at work. And I work 12-hour shifts in the hospital, so sometimes I just need to come home and take a long hot shower, go to bed as early as possible. But really for me, it's a matter of recognizing that I'm stressed so that I don't allow myself to lash out. And I think what Jack said about being willing to talk about things, that's really important too, because we both, he's a chaplain and I work in a NICU, so we both see and handle some difficult things, so I think it's important to kind of process that on your own, but then be willing to talk about it and bring it to your marriage in a healthy way.
Absolutely. We all need to have a plan for how we deal with outside stressors so that it doesn't compound maybe the conflict that you're having within your marriage. And just find ways to cool off. Go for a walk. Take a long shower, take a nap, do whatever you need to do to find a way to manage your emotions instead of letting your emotions control you. And so as we go through life, as we go through our marriage, remember, you have a teammate by your side who is with you no matter what, who puts you above everything else. We need to be able to communicate with them our expectations and hear their expectations as well, to come together with a plan that works so that we're minimizing conflict within our relationship, and we can use that relationship to just strengthen ourselves, to have that joy, to make home a place that we're excited to come back to. Because no matter what the world may throw us, when you do marriage the right way, you have that person who's by your side, who's with you. And so I want to thank you guys for tuning in with us. Hopefully by June, things will kind of calm down a little bit and we'll be able to have the full date night experience with the childcare, which I know a lot of you guys are probably really looking forward to, but as well as the meal and some of the activities that we had planned as well. But I do want to let you guys know, hey, if you are having conflict, if you are having mismatched expectations and you're having a hard time working through it on your own, man, come find me. Come find myself or Rincon. Man, we would love to sit down and talk with you and your spouse and just try to find a way to work through it together as a team. We also have a lot of resources available in the chaplain office, and so come by, check out some of those books that we have as well. But just know, I'm always available. I care about you guys. I want what's best for you and your spouse, and I want to see marriages flourish. I want to see marriages strengthened here in this battalion. And so however I can be of help, man, please let me know. But thank you guys for tuning in, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.